Hello everyone, nice to see you. This is our second lecture that joins together the face-to-face class at Notre Dame on the Quran with the MOOC on edX, Introduction to the Quran. Last time we spoke about theology and the nature of God in the Quran, and in this lecture we'll be speaking about the history of Islamic interpretation of the Quran. As many of you already know, the standard term for interpretation in Islamic tradition is tafsir. There's a second term which is ta'wil, which really means reducing to its fundamentals. That's also used, but we'll be referring to tafsir during this lecture. Now, before we get into looking at the history of tafsir and thinking about a classification of different periods of tafsir, there's like a very basic point that can be made, which is tafsir is not, in fact, comprehensive of the totality of Islamic interpretation of the Quran. So tafsir is a discrete literary genre, and as I'll mention, marked generally by an atomistic approach to the Quran. That is, most mufassirun, those who do tafsir, proceed surah by surah, chapter by chapter, and verse by verse. So if you're going to sit down and you're going to write a tafsir, you don't think, for example, of a theme. You don't think about prophecy and write chapter 1 on prophecy, or creation and write chapter 1 on creation, or maybe the jinn, or some other theme, right? You begin instead with Surah Al-Fatiha. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Those first two verses, and you ask yourself, what do those verses mean? And you can ask different questions about those verses. Some mufassirun start with the grammar and the syntax in Arabic, nahu wa sarf, so the grammar and syntax of those verses. You might analyze individual words and debates about the meaning of particular words. You might analyze related hadith or traditions that were transmitted by earlier communities of Muslims about those. And you might look at how the Quran can interpret the Quran. That is, how other passages within the Quran can shed light on those two verses. So that's what I mean by tafsir. It's this discrete literary genre marked by a particular method, a method that we can call atomistic. Does that phrase make sense? So like atomistic, piece by piece, verse by verse, right? You know, every once in a while, mufassirun will group together 3 or 4 or 5 verses and deal with all of them at once. But the procedure is still basically atomistic. And that's been criticized by some. Anyway, we'll speak a little bit about that. But I'd also like to make the point that there are other genres outside of tafsir which also deal with the elaboration of the Quran, or which are also marked by the Quran. And indeed, one could say that all of the Islamic sciences, and maybe in some ways, all of the Arabic literary tradition is shaped by the Quran in some way. So even literary works, think of the Arabian Nights. What's like the most famous thing from the Arabian Nights is the appearance of jinn in different ways. Like in the Disney movie Aladdin, the story of Aladdin is marked by the appearance of the genie, which of course comes from jinn. But the notion of jinn comes from the Quran itself. So even literary works are marked by the Quran. But so too many other Islamic sciences. Jurisprudence is shaped by debates around Quranic verses on any sort of question, whether it's ablutions before praying, whether it's marriage and divorce, whether it's war and peace. Those jurisprudential or legal debates are marked by the Quran and involve Quranic exegesis or commentary. Also, even sciences like linguistics, Arabic linguistics, the standard of proper rhetorical expression is always the Quran. If there's a question that's unclear and you have different schools of grammarians, as there were, for example, in Kufa and Basra, 2 Iraqi cities, the standard of reference for proper Arabic expression is the Quran. Another genre in which the Quran is influential is the formation of hadith. Many hadith are expansions or explanations of things that we find in the Quran. And besides the fact that whole chapters of the hadith are dedicated to hadith which explicitly explain the Quran. Chapters known as Kitab al-Tafsir, the book on tafsir. Anyway, I don't want to go on forever about this point, but hopefully it's clear enough that exegesis or commentary on the Quran is not limited to tafsir. Tafsir is a discrete literary genre with a certain methodology which shapes it and which is easily recognizable. And in the lecture that we're about to go to with a PowerPoint, I'm going to establish sort of 3 different periods for tafsir: early, classical, and modern. But all 3 periods are marked by this atomistic method of proceeding verse by verse, or bunch of verses by bunch of verses. So that's pretty consistent throughout the history of tafsir. In fact, in order to be recognized as a tafsir, you have to proceed in this atomistic format. Okay? I mean, another genre, just like one added thing here, an addendum to all of this. Another genre is poetry. The Islamic, Arabic, and Persian tradition of poetry is intensely marked by the Quran. For example, we've spoken in our face-to-face class about the history of Noah having another son in the Quran, which appears in Surah Hud, chapter 11 of the Quran. He has this son who was lost in the flood. And there's a beautiful poem written by an Egyptian poet who was sort of irreligious himself, but was interested in this story, who wrote a poem about the lost son, the drowned son, and in his poem he sort of vindicates the last son, because he made the decision to stay with the people and not escape from the people. But even then, even in an irreligious poem, it's marked by the Quran. Okay, hopefully that point is clear enough. Why don't we go on to the development of Quranic exegesis. This is going to be like the whole history of 1,400-year history of exegesis, all compressed into about an hour. So keep your expectations low. And we'll try to do some justice to this very rich history. And just, to get a sense, some of the MOOC students will know from when I do those video updates, which I film once a week, usually from my office. You can see the Arabic books in the background, and those of you who visit my office have seen them. We have compendia of tafsirs, which can be 15 or 20 volumes. One of the longest is by Fakhruddin Razi, a classical tafsir, which in the modern edition is extremely voluminous. In modern tafsirs also, for example, by the Shiite Iranian Tabatabai, goes in modern editions, is printed in many, many volumes. So you have a large tradition that we're compressing into a small time frame. We're going to do so in 3 periods. First, we're going to look at early commentaries. I think I already mentioned this. And then classical commentaries, and then modern commentaries. And there you have the term up there, tafsir. So let's begin with the early commentaries. I'm going to look at just one scholar as an example. Scholar by the name of Muqatil ibn Sulaiman. He's a good example because not only is his commentary early, but it's the earliest. In fact, his death date is convenient, 767, because it's the same date of the death of the earliest biographer of the Prophet, Ibn Ishaq. This sort of marks the genesis of Arabic Islamic literature. Now, there's some controversy about whether his exegesis or commentary can be safely ascribed to him, because in fact it was transmitted, our first manuscripts come from a much later period. And if you actually sit down and you read the tafsir, what you find is someone is saying, and Muqatil said, right? The way that the commentary is expressed is, Muqatil said, yada, yada, yada. So it's more quotations of Muqatil than Muqatil himself speaking about the Quran. So clearly it's gone through a reception history, but still it's generally referred to as Tafsir Muqatil and attributed to him. And some scholars would make the case that it can be safely dated to Muqatil ibn Sulaiman. Okay, there's a couple of points that we want to make about these early commentaries like Muqatil, but the most important point is this. Muqatil and early commentaries are basically interested in storytelling. That is, the science of exegesis becomes a way of elaborating on things that are unclear in the Quran. And most people think the genesis of tafsir itself is marked by a context of storytelling, where there are pious believers reading the text with questions about the text. Something we're going to speak about today, another episode of Quran chapter 11, is the wife of Abraham laughs. Now, the text never explicitly describes or gives a reason for why she laughed, And so scholars were interested, or even presumably pious believers were interested in what's the reason for our laughter. Quran chapter 4, 157 speaks of Jesus not being killed, or at least of the Israelites not killing or crucifying Jesus. But it doesn't say if he wasn't killed, and it doesn't say if he wasn't killed, who was killed in his place, if anyone. All of these things are left unclear, right? So all of these sort of questions which the text provokes seem to have, in fact, generated the earliest period of tafsir. And there's a nice Arabic expression for this, which is on the slide there, which is ta'yin al-mubham, which is literally the designation of that which is ambiguous. And that's the role that these early commentaries play. In a sense, the way that these early commentaries work is more or less to give a paraphrase of the Quranic text, but to add those elements which are missing in the scripture itself. One example, we were just speaking about Quran chapter 4, verse 157, which says that the Israelites did not kill or crucify مَا قَتَلُوهُ وَمَا صَلَبُوهُ وَلَكِنْ شُبِّهَ لَهُمْ. They did not kill him, and they did not crucify him, but instead something was made to appear to them. Tafsir Muqatil explains what that something was. It was a person. Someone was changed to look like Jesus, and that person was Judas, was his betrayer. This is an interesting topic for this week, because on Friday, most Christians around the world will celebrate Good Friday, which will mark the crucifixion. But according to Tafsir Muqatil, it wasn't Jesus who was crucified, it was Judas. So it's just a simple example of ta'yin and mubham. Identify something which is unclear in the text itself. Here's another example of how the early mufassirun do ta'yin and mubham. Quran chapter 2, verse 30 recounts the creation of man, or humanity, by God. But it refers to humanity as a khalifa. Now this word is a little bit problematic. The verse begins by saying, وَإِذْ قَالَ رَبُّكَ لِلْمَلَائِكَةِ إِنِّي جَعَلٌ فِي الْأَرْضِ خَلِيفَةً. And your Lord said to the angels, I am going to make on the earth a khalifa. Now, khalifa can mean either representative or successor. You might recognize the term because later on it's taken in Arabic political discourse to mean caliph, right, to mean the ruler. But in the Quran itself, it seems to mean either representative or successor. Now, Muqatil takes the line that it means successor, but that leaves you with a question. If God referred to humans as a successor, what's the question? Yeah, exactly. Who are they succeeding? Who came before them? And as you see from the slide there, Tafsir Muqatil has an answer, which is first God created the angels and the jinn. And so humans were succeeding the angels and the jinn. And in particular the jinn, because the jinn were the residents of earth and humans were meant to replace them. And the story is elaborated in later Islamic tradition, but Tafsir Muqatil doesn't go into this detail. Later Islamic tradition says the jinn began to shed blood and cause mischief on earth, and so God had to send the angels down to conquer them and banish them to far off places. And then God was like, I need to replace someone, I need to replace the jinn, and so I'm going to put humans in their place. Tafsir Muqatil doesn't go into all those details. He just says, the jinn were on earth first, humans succeeded them. That's why humans are called khalif. Okay? Ta'yin and mubham. Fair enough. One more example. Oh, there's a couple more comments here. Just to add that Muqatil has no problem citing Jewish and Christian traditions. In later tafsir, this will not be taken for granted. Especially with late classical mufassirun, who become concerned only to cite prophetic hadith and will be suspicious of any material that comes from Jews or Christians. But this is not a concern of Muqatil. So he's happy to quote stories that come from Jewish and Christian sources. And just one anecdote about this, when I was a graduate student and in Beirut, Lebanon, my advisor was very interested, a professor at Yale was very interested in Muqatil, and he said, listen, when you're over in Lebanon, it's a great place to buy books, you know? It's a wonderful place to buy books. Make sure you buy Muqatil's tafsir. Make sure you buy his exegesis. It's not very long, it's 4 or 5 volumes in the Egyptian edition. And so it'll be very useful, etc. And so I went over there and I went to a bookstore and I found Tafsir Muqatil. I was very excited and I was interested especially in what he had to say about Jesus in the Quran. So I brought it home and I looked up a couple of passages about Jesus in the Quran, for example, Surah Al-Ma'idah, and suddenly I turned to a passage that really interested me about Jesus, and I turned the page there and it was blank. So, like blank, like nothing, right? And so, what do you do then? You call the bookstore, and you're like, I was like, what's going on here? You sold me a faulty book. Has a blank page right there in Surah Al-Ma'idah. And can anyone guess what had happened?
Censored.
It had been censored, exactly. He was like, no, don't blame me. That's the way it was censored in Egypt when the book was reprinted. So it was reprinted and the Egyptian authorities censored certain pages which were considered to be heterodox because they relied on Jewish and Christian sources in Tafsir Muqatil. And so I then went back to the library when I got back to New Haven, Connecticut, to Yale's library, which had the first edition, not the reprinted edition, and I copied the pages that were missing and taped them into my little book. And if you come to my office, I'll show you the tape pages, which go over the blank pages for Tafsir Muqatil. Okay. Another point here is Tafsir Muqatil is not concerned with prophetic infallibility. The doctrine of Isma, the notion that the prophets are impeccable or infallible. There are many anecdotes that we've encountered in this course, not only that the question of the Prophet Muhammad, but other earlier prophets, the story, for example, of Moses killing an Egyptian, or Adam disobeying God by eating from the forbidden tree, or Lot, his actions with his daughters, like all these accounts, Jonah, who seems to be disobedient, all these accounts that seem to show the prophets not acting perfectly. Later exegetes will be very concerned to defend that they were still impeccable or infallible, and early tafsirs usually don't have this concern. I was going to give one other example of Ta'yin al-Mubham, and this comes from Quran chapter 3, which speaks about Mary. And it says that Mary was in a building called the Mihrab. Now, Mihrab today is very familiar to Muslims because the word is used to refer to the niche inside of a mosque, which indicates the direction of prayer, that is the direction of Mecca. So a little alcove in a mosque. Every mosque, to be a mosque, you have to have two things. You have to have a niche, which the Mihrab, which represents the direction of prayer, and you have to have a mimbar, which is the podium from which the khutbah or the Friday sermon is given. So you need to have both of those things. Now, but in the Quran, clearly this is not what mihrab means, because there's no mosques, unless there's a primitive one in the Prophet's own residence. But this is a reference not to the Prophet's time, but to Mary's time, so there's no mosque, and it doesn't make sense to think Mary inside of a niche in a mosque. So it has to refer to something else. And the commentators tried to figure this out and identify what this mihrab was. And so Muqatil has this tradition that it's a hut or enclosure that Mary was kept in, basically to keep her in a state of purity, and it was inside the temple in Jerusalem, because she was raised in the temple according to this tradition. By the way, he's drawing on a Christian source here. Anyone know what Christian source? About Mary being raised in the temple? Yeah, good. The Proto-Evangelium of James, the Proto-Gospel of James, is where this is coming from. And this is the identification of the mihrab as a hut or enclosure. And she was only let out when she had her menses or when she menstruated, because she would have sullied or defiled the temple, according to his understanding. Okay, so just another example of tayin and mubham. Let's go on to classical commentaries. Now, I reference in particular Abu Ja'far al-Tabari, who is the classical commentator. He's sort of the greatest authority for his work, and that's especially because he provides a compilation of earlier views. So on a question such as the crucifixion or the mihrab, Tabari won't simply identify as Muqatil does. This is a big difference, right? He won't simply identify as Muqatil does who was crucified or what the mihrab is. He will report a number of earlier views. Okay, so some people like to call this polyvalent. So this is a difference between early commentaries and classical commentaries. Classical commentaries, most of them, including others that we'll cite, like Fakhruddin al-Razi and Thalabi and some others, are polyvalent. So different opinions on any single question are offered. And we've already mentioned this notion that they're atomistic. Now I've put in a note here, versus stories of the Prophet. So let me just make a very brief detour and say that there is another genre of Islamic literature which is exegetical. And I didn't mention it in my long opening, introductory comments, which is known as stories of the prophets, Qisas al-Anbiya. And this genre of literature proceeds chronologically, unlike the Quran. It starts with Adam and proceeds up through Muhammad and gives sort of a single account or narrative for each prophet, integrating within it different material in the Quran. That material in the Quran might be scattered throughout the Quranic text. Material, for example, on Jesus will come, from Surah 3, Surah 5, Surah 19, even other surahs further along in the text, like Surah 61. And it will all be brought together into one coherent narrative. Right? So that's not atomistic. That's more literary. But Tabari, like other classical commentaries, is atomistic. Tabari is marked by this notion of ijaz, which we've spoken about both in the MOOC and the face-to-face class. That's very important. We've learned it's sort of a complicated notion. Ijaz, right? What is ijaz exactly? What is the Quran? Literally means to render something else incapable. It's a verbal noun of a Form 4 Arabic word. Ijaz. Render something else incapable or powerless. But Tabari understands this notion and believes in the perfection of the Quranic text. When he measures different opinions, he's not dogmatic in choosing one above the others. So very often he will say things like in Arabic, وَقَدْ اخْتَلَفُوا أَهْلُ التَّأْوِيلِ فِي تَأْوِيلِ ذَلِكَ. And the commentators have differed over the meaning of that. And that's it. Come on, give me something, give me an answer. And he'll just leave you like that. Other times he'll give a series of opinions, and we'll see an example of this. And he'll present his view at the end. But even when he has his own view, even when he presents his own view, he'll often add something like, Wallahu alam, which means, and God knows best, meaning, maybe I'm wrong. Or there's this nice Arabic word, which is asah, which means more correct, I don't think we have one word for that in English. So instead of just saying sahih, which means the correct view, he'll say asah, more correct, but it sort of implies there might be something correct in the other views as well, right? So again, it's polyvalent. Okay, and here's just the example I wanted to give with Tabari, which is the question of Sarah's laughter. This is Quran chapter 11, verse 71. we might just take a second to read the verse at hand. His wife was standing by, so she laughed. Now, this word "so" is important. The Arabic is وَإِمْرَأَتُهُ قَائِمَةٌ فَضَحِكَتْ. Okay, so the "so" is rendering that Arabic particle fa. Okay, and we gave her good news of Isaac, and after Isaac, Jacob. Okay, I mean, I've given all the reasons there that Tabari will entertain, but let me just sort of note the problem here. Okay, problem is this. In the biblical subtext of the Quran, it's well known why Sarah laughed. Again, Quran doesn't give her name as Sarah, but we can sort of safely identify her as Sarah in light of the Quran's biblical subtext. So in the Bible, does anyone know why Sarah laughs? What's the deal with Sarah laughing?
Yeah. Is it because she's told she's going to conceive at such an old age?
Exactly. So in Genesis 18, 3 angels come and visit Abraham and Sarah. They announce that Sarah will have a son, and she's beyond the age of childbearing, and so she laughs because she finds it incredible. So that's clear, right? But in the Quran, if you notice with the way this is articulated, it's not clear that's why she's laughing. In fact, وَإِمْرَأَتُهُ قَائِمَةٌ فَضَحِكَتْ فَبَشَرْنَاهَا بِإِسْحَاقَ. His wife was standing by, and she laughed, and we gave her good news of Isaac. I don't know, is it "and" there? Yeah, "and." It seems to be that the good news comes after the laughter, right? The announcement or the annunciation comes after the laughter. And so commentators were left with different options. And Tabari cites 7 different views on this question. Polyvalent. 1, maybe she laughed because she saw that Abraham's guests, the visitors, the Quran speaks of them as Rusul in chapter 11, elsewhere as Daif, as guests, that Abraham's guests did not eat. There's another contrast between the Quran and the Bible. In Genesis 18, they do eat. In the Quran, they do not eat, which probably reflects a conviction that they were angels, and angels don't eat. Right? Okay. 2, she laughed because she heard that the angels were to destroy the people of Lot. And she was happy about that. I didn't write that on the slide. But she was happy about that because they were sinners. And so she was like, yes, those sinners are going to get what they deserve, right? They're going to be destroyed. Okay? So that's 2. And then 3, she realized that the visitors would not do to them that which Lot's people were known to do. So they were afraid of basically the sexual violence associated with the people of Lot. And when she realized that this was not going to happen, that the angels were not part of the people of Lot, she was relieved and she laughed. Reason number 4, she saw Abraham's fear of the messengers. The Quranic text actually earlier in Surah 11 actually says Abraham was afraid. He's afraid when they don't reach for the food. So she saw that Abraham was afraid, and she thought it was funny, so she was sort of laughing at her husband, which is not very nice. And then 5, because she received the good news of Isaac and Jacob. Now that's a weird one. That's actually what the biblical subtext suggests. But in order to hold number 5 as the valid explanation, you have to flip the text around. And there's like a grammatical, syntactical explanation in Arabic which allows you to do that. It's called taqdeem, or sometimes it's called ta'khir al-muqaddam, which means putting back that which comes first. Or you can express it that way around, and you can say putting first that which comes second. Okay? And the idea is something can have a particular order in the way it's articulated, in its lafz, but in its mana, in its sense, it's supposed to be understood in the reverse order. Does that make sense, sort of? So that's what you do here. You say, okay, the Annunciation is mentioned second, but it should be understood first. And that's why she laughed. Okay, so that's number 5. And number 6 is a good one too. she did not laugh at all, but the Arabic word dahikat here, it actually doesn't mean laughter. It's just like, I don't know, can someone quickly think of a word that has two totally different meanings? How about this? What's that?
Cleave.
Yeah, cleave.
One is to separate, one is to put together.
It's just like cleave. That's great. Yeah, which can mean to separate or put together. That was brilliant. Yeah, that was not prepared. That was spontaneous. Right? So same thing with dahikat. It usually means to laugh, but in this case, it means hadat in Arabic, which means to menstruate, to have your period. Which would sort of make sense, right? Because she had gone through menopause and stopped having her period, and then, like, she had her period, like, boom, like that. And she's like, I can have a baby again, and that's what actually is meant by dahikat, right? Tabari thinks this is crazy because some grammarians, I think of the school of Kufa, don't even recognize the secondary meaning for dahikat. And then finally, out of relief that her family was going to be safe, that someone else would. Anyway, so after all this, Tabari says, the best explanation is that Abraham's wife laughed out of satisfaction that Lot's people would be destroyed. And the reason why he does this is because of the syntax of the Quran. The last phrase in the Quran before she laughed, at the end of the previous verse, is, do not fear, we have been sent to the people of Lot. So he's shaped by the precise syntax of the Arabic text. And that reflects his high recognition of the inimitability of the Quran. Don't let your reason interfere too much with the way the Quran is structured. Questions or comments about any of that? Okay, that provides us some insight. Don't be, shy face-to-face students. If you have questions or comments, that's fine. So, but that gives us some insight into the way Tabari works. Now, we're sort of grouped together all of these classical commentators, and it's a bit unfair because actually there are a number of different ones who have different ideological tendencies. So, for example, around the time of Tabari, just a little bit earlier, is Ali al-Qummi, who is a Shiite. Two things to say about him. He's known for a method which is also found with Tabari, which is tafsir bil-ma'thur, which means explaining things through received traditions, which is opposed to tafsir bil-ra'i, which means explaining things through rational explanation. So he's known for received traditions. So is Tabari, although there's rationalism as well. Tabari sort of combines both. The other thing Qummi is known for is sectarian interpretation. So certain verses, he's going to argue, have explicit references to Shiite doctrine or to particular individuals who are important in Shiite salvation history. Okay, so that's one. Another is Zamakhshari, who we're going to look at again in a second. Zamakhshari is from the Mu'tazili school that we've heard about already, which is the rationalizing school in Islamic theology, hence rationalist. Another is someone we've mentioned already, Fakhruddin Arazi, who's also a rationalist, but not from the Mu'tazila, from the Ash'ariyya. Okay, and but still has a philosophical bent, but he applies his philosophical learning towards the defense of traditional Ash'ari dogma on questions such as free will, or the attributes of God, or the createdness of the Quran, or anthropomorphisms in the text. Ibn Kathir is a very interesting case because, remember, I was referring to late classical commentators. He's sort of the par excellence example of a late classical commentator. He's a Shafi'i himself, but was closely affiliated with Hanbalis, the conservative jurisprudential school. He's very suspicious of Riza and Ra'i, whereas Zamakhshari and Razi, to different extents, both embrace Ra'i. Ibn Kathir is very suspicious, and he seeks to interpret the Quran with the Quran or the Hadith. Right? For Ibn Kathir, rationalism should be eliminated from the process of exegesis as much as possible. Because the human intellect is fundamentally unreliable. What's reliable is divine revelation. So the intellect is only a tool which allows us to compare different elements or aspects of divine revelation. If you can explain something in the Quran by something else in the Quran, that's great. Alhamdulillah, praise be to God. If you can explain something in the Quran with something in the Hadith, that's also great, praise be to God, because the Hadith also come from God, through the life and deeds and speech of the Prophet Muhammad. Okay? But the human intellect, when it interferes, it leads you astray, it leads you away from Islam. And that's, in different places, he, along with one of his authorities, Ibn Taymiyyah, would hold that that's what led Jews and Christians away from the revelations given to Moses and Jesus, was they departed from revelation by following their reason. Okay, so I think that's the final one. Yep, final one is Tafsir al-Jalalain. This is like the standard text. Maria.
It seems like the later ones are kind of concurrent with Thomas Aquinas' baptizing Aristotle in the Christian West. Do any of the rationalist commentators rely on Aristotle?
Yes, yeah. So, Razi in particular is in conversation, not with Aristotle directly to my knowledge, but with Aristotle as interpreted by earlier Muslim philosophers. And Aristotle was sort of the principal conversation partner of early Muslim philosophers. People like Farabi and Avicenna, Ibn Sina in Arabic, who their ideas on metaphysics, especially, but also on the human person, in the human soul, and ethics, were shaped by Aristotle. Also, there's a text known as the Theology of Aristotle that was actually a Neoplatonic text that was mistakenly attributed in the Islamic East to Aristotle, but also some Aristotelian texts that were transmitted by translations that went from Greek to Syriac to Arabic, sometimes right from Greek to Arabic. And these commentators such as Razi were familiar with this literature. They were suspicious of philosophers, because philosophers, when they do their thing, philosophers, they're not quoting scripture at all. They're just being philosophers, as Notre Dame students know, since for the moment, at least for a couple more weeks, we still have 2 philosophy requirements. Anyway, that's another topic. Right? So, but philosophers, when they do their thing, they're not commenting on scripture. They're just reasoning out, thinking through principles such as goodness, beauty, truth, justice, etc. And so, theologically minded exegetes are suspicious of the philosophers, but they still incorporate their insights. Good question. Yeah. Anyway, the last exegesis from the classical period I was going to mention is known as Tafsir Jalalain. It's a neat title. Jalalain literally means the 2 Jalals, and you'll see why, because the 2 authors of this treatise are both named Jalal. This sort of returns us in a way back to Tafsir al-Maqata, because it is simply a paraphrasing of the Quran, and often just a simple glossing of Quranic terms, which may be obscure or unclear to the reader from the 16th century. And so words that are difficult are just identified with a contemporary Arabic word. And that's why some scholars have called Tafsir al-Jalalain translation of the Quran into Arabic. It's a very short text, and people have short volumes that are not much bigger than a normal mushaf or volume of the Quran that have the entire commentary of Tafsir al-Jalalain with them. Okay, so I'm just going to give a couple examples here of classical commentaries. We've mentioned Tabari, but I wanted to give some, Tabari, has this compilation approach. I wanted to give some more some views which are more closely aligned with particular trends, theological trends. One of those is Zamakhshari, who we've identified as Mu'tazili. And so the bit I want to look at for Zamakhshari is this verse towards the very beginning of the text, which says God has set a seal on their hearts and their hearing. Now, for many Muslim commentators, there's no issue here. There's nothing to worry about here. God is omnipotent. He decides whom he would like to guide and whom he would like to lead astray. That's within his divine election. Right? That's sort of the standard Ash'ari approach, also the Hanbali approach. God can do as he wills. You can't limit God's will or God's authority or God's sovereignty. But the Mu'tazila said, no, we know certain things about God. We know this rationally, even before reading Revelation. We know rationally that God must be just. He must be one, known in Arabic as Tawheed, and he must be just, known in Arabic as Adl. And so when Mu'tazila encountered verses such as this, they were like, we've got a situation on our hands. How could God be just if he sets a seal on people's hearts and ears and thereby prevents them from believing? And what happens when you're prevented from believing on the Day of Judgment? What happens?
Great punishment. Hellfire.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. Hellfire, right? How could God... I was once in a conversation with a couple of young Shiite madrasa students, and they were, in Shiites, in a lot of theological matters, inclined towards Mu'tazili views. And they said the standard Ash'ari view of divine predestination, or God's leading astray of people, it makes a laughingstock out of the Day of Judgment. How could God condemn to hell those whom he is prevented from believing? So there was a situation here for Mu'tazila. So Zamakhshari said, well, not so fast. God setting a seal on hearts cannot actually mean he sets a seal on hearts. It can mean one of the following things. One, it can mean that the Arabic word seal doesn't refer to God interfering with humans' ability to believe. It refers to an innate disposition of unbelief already present in the unbeliever. So that's one explanation. Another is sealing is just a metaphor. Doesn't mean that God literally prevents someone from believing. And he gives some examples. People say the mountain torrent has flown away with someone when a person has died. And actually, the mountain torrent had nothing to do with this person at all. So too, God had nothing to do with the failure of this person to believe. It's just a way of speaking, right? And a third example is maybe it's Satan or the unbelievers themselves who have set a seal on their hearts. And God is given credit for that because God gave the power to Satan and the unbelievers to do that. Okay, any questions or comments about that? So here we can see a theologically minded, Mu'tazili minded interpretation of a Quranic passage. Okay, we have one more example here from classical Mufassirun, and then we'll look at just a couple of examples of modern Mufassirun, and then we'll be done. That'll be it. It's going to be painless. Okay, Abraham and the stars. Okay, this is an interesting passage that appears in Quran Surah 6, which has to do with Abraham's discovery of monotheism. Now, this is an interesting situation because although it's not really explicit in the Quran itself, in Islamic exegesis, maybe being informed by Jewish and Christian tradition, the stories were told that Abraham, he wasn't raised in a community of monotheists. Actually, that much is explicit in the Quran. Abraham confronts his father, who's an unbeliever and his people who are unbelievers. So he wasn't raised in a community of monotheists. He was raised in a community of pagans, maybe idolaters. And so the question is, well, then how did he come to believe? Right? Most people come to believe because of someone who believes already informs them and shapes them to be a believer. But Abraham had no one around. He just had these pagans all around him, you know. So the story is told, which is actually, I mean, the Quran, most Muslim exegetes don't mention this. Actually, a lot of these stories were told by Jewish and Christian sources. For example, a text known as the Apocalypse of Abraham. But also there are hints of this in Jewish thinkers such as Philo of Alexandria, that Abraham figured things out just by looking at the astral bodies, the heavenly bodies. And the Quran tells a story about how that went down. The story goes that Abraham, he looks up and he sees a star and he thinks of worshiping it, and then a moon and thinks of worshiping that, and then finally the sun, and he thinks of worshiping that because it's bigger, but these bodies keep on setting, and he's like, oh drat, I can't worship these things. And so he finally says, indeed I have turned my face toward him who originated the heavens and the earth as a Hanif. Hanif means something like a pre-Muhammadan monotheist. Sometimes translated as a natural monotheist or a natural believer. Okay, fine, good enough. Now, I just brought a passage here from Ibn Kathir, who we've mentioned is very suspicious of rational interpretations, but he's also very suspicious of anything that would cast a dispersion upon a prophet. So he's very much shaped by isma, by the notion of prophetic infallibility. So he's worried about this passage, right? Because it looks like Abraham really, for a moment, at least contemplated worshiping a star, and maybe really did, at least for a moment, worship the star, at least till it set, right? And the moon and the sun. And Ibn Kathir is like, that would be bad. Abraham should only worship God. He's a prophet. And so he has this explanation here. Sorry, my head is in the way. My big head. So Ibn Kathir, he cites a hadith where the Prophet declares, everyone is born according to the fitrah. So he refers to the hadith to explain this Quranic passage. And he says, in Islam, everyone is born a Muslim. Ibn Kathir comments, if this is true for the rest of people, how much more so would it be true for Abraham, the close friend of God? So he says it's impossible that he really would have considered worshipping the astral body, because he had this natural instinct, according to hadith, which would have him be a pure monotheist. Okay? So that's an example there. Any comments so far? That's the end of our bit on the classical commentaries. And we'll move on in a moment to the modern ones. Yeah, Eric.
So is problem assuming that monotheism is the obvious choice? Or that, so I'm guessing the problem is that Abraham, it should be obvious to him, but is it obvious simply because he's a prophet? Or is it because the natural world would obviously make monotheism the clear choice?
Yeah, it's not the natural world as much as the human constitution. And it's not sought out in sort of carefully defined anthropological ways. It's simply articulated or expressed by quoting the hadith. For Ibn Kathir, that's all you have to do. You just quote the hadith. The hadith says everyone is born according to the fitrah. The fitrah is understood to be monotheism. This fitrah, this natural instinct, is understood to be monotheism, so everyone is born a Muslim. The full hadith goes on to say, it's your parents who turn you into a Jew or a Christian or Zoroastrian. Okay, so try to keep my head out of the way here, and let's move on to modern commentators. Again, we can't really do justice to this. There's a great book by my colleague at Notre Dame, Munim Suri, Scriptural Polemics, where he deals with a lot of the modern commentators, which is worth reading. But you're stuck with me for the moment, sorry. So we'll just look at a number of figures. I'm just going to mention them, and then I'll give two examples of a little bit closer analysis from them. So, among influential 20th century, 19th, 20th century commentators are the Egyptian reformist Muhammad Abdu. He's reformist in the sense that he's seen as someone who, on the one hand, is suspicious of received tradition and seeks to have new and original interpretations on the basis of the Quran itself. And reformist, on the other hand, because those new and original interpretations are marked by rationalism. Not in the sense of the Mu'tazila. He doesn't incline to Mu'tazila doctrine, but he does seek, especially when it comes to supernatural elements in the Quran, to come up with scientific explanations for them. So that's Muhammad Abdu. Someone who lived at basically the same time is the Syrian Jamal ad-Din al-Qasimi, who was a Syrian and is known as a proto-Salafi. Salafism, of course, is the movement which originates more or less in Saudi Arabia, which looks to return to the first three generations of Muslims to establish proper Islamic practice and to purify Islam of any innovation which entered later. Later in the 20th century, we have the Egyptian rigorist member of the Muslim Brotherhood, eventually executed, Sayyid Qutb. We'll be looking at something from him. He's not totally opposed to the rationalism of Muhammad Abdu, but he constructs a world in which Muslims are fundamentally in a struggle or competition with the darkness of unbelief and unbelievers. So his vision of the world is very much shaped by this struggle against unbelief and unbelievers. Ignorance is the term he likes to use for unbelief. Tunisian Ibn Ashur, who integrates some more than others insights from, even though he was in Tunisia where there were very few Christians and only a few Jews, but he integrates insights from biblical tradition in his commentary. The Indian / Pakistani, once Pakistan is created, Abu al-Ala al-Mawdudi, who is very also conservative and similar in some of his views to Sayyid Qutb, but an important a commentator also on the text. The Shiite Tabatabai, who quite unlike Qutb and Mawdudi is very interested in philosophy, in philosophical underpinnings to the Quranic text. Now, what can we say about all of these together? Well, it's pretty difficult to group all of them together because there's a great diversity of ethnicities and ideologies, but there is something common to their engagement with modernity. That might be obvious. I mean, this little section is called Modern Commentaries, right? So you were like, tell me something I didn't know. But this is important, the engagement with modernity, right? Because modernity, on the one hand, presents Muslims with the challenge of Christianity in a new way because of Christian missions. And so there's an interest in articulating an apologetics for Islam in response to Christian missions, which have entered into Egypt and South Asia and elsewhere, Syria. And on the other hand, the secular West, so not Christian missions, but the secular West, with its skepticism for religious matters and the apparent rise of science and all of the dimensions of that term, would seem to threaten traditional religious views. So this is something that all of the commentators have to deal with. one of the ways they deal with this is by trying to argue that the Quran, in terms of its ethics, is not inferior or backwards, but is superior to Western ethics, and in terms of science, is in fact scientifically correct, and in a way that would have been in fact impossible for a 7th century person to articulate, and therefore that's a sign of its divine source. This notion, sometimes called concordism, but this notion of scientific miracles in the Quran. Both things, the ethics and the science, fundamentally apologetical. They're a response to modernity. Maria.
So they're coming from all over the Muslim world. Are they all formed in universities in kind of the Arabic world? Or are they reflecting scholarly traditions from universities in their home countries?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, with the exception of Maududi and Tabatabai, the first 4 are all Arabs. They're all formed in the Arab world, in traditional Islamic institutions. Abdu was in Al-Azhar, the standard Sunni institution of learning in Egypt, and others were formed also in Islamic institutions. Tabatabai was formed in the traditional Shiite institutions known as the Hawza, and Maududi also studied in madrasas in South Asia, but even there, he was shaped by the Arabic language. So instruction, even in South Asia, in these madrasas, is in Arabic, and oftentimes instructors are brought from Egypt or Saudi Arabia to teach in these institutions. So the Arab Middle East continues to have sort of this, to radiate its particular institutions and methods in the formation of teachers throughout the Islamic world.
So you could say that the Arab world is more or less synonymous with the Muslim world? Or is it geographically?
God bless you. No, it's not synonymous, right? And the majority of Muslims are not Arabs. The largest Muslim country is Indonesia, right? And second is India, and then Pakistan. And so none of them are Arab countries. So, right. So, but because of the sacredness of the Arabic language, the conviction that it's God's language, it's the language of the Quran, it's the proper language of discourse for religious sciences, all over the Islamic world, even in Indonesia, instruction in religious sciences is often given in Arabic, and teachers are formed usually in Egypt or Saudi Arabia, and then returned to Nigeria or South Africa or Indonesia to teach in institutions there. Okay, we're going to wrap up just with 2 examples of modern commentators. I mentioned the pressure of modernity. Oh, and this led to, remember when I was like, this thing, they're fundamentally apologetical. This just leads to new dimensions to the doctrine of infallibility, of inimitability of the Quran, or ijaz. So it's inimitable also in its ethical and scientific content. Okay, so we won't read through this whole thing. I just want to give one example for Muhammad Abdu of his rationalizing. That's pretty interesting. Quran 105 has this famous example. It begins with God telling the Prophet, Alam tara kayfa fa'ala rabbuka bi ashab al-fil? Did you not see how your Lord dealt with the companions of the elephant? It goes on to speak of birds, tayr, who seem to be throwing something at the companions of the elephant. This is traditionally explained by God really sending birds who really have stones and cast them down on an invading army, an army invading Mecca. Muhammad Abdu is like, yeah, I don't know about this. He says, maybe it's something else, that this sort of shows us instead that the smallpox and measles were produced by solid stones carried and thrown on the soldiers by flocks of birds that are helped on the way by winds. So it wasn't actual stones that killed the army, it was some sort of pestilence or disease that was spread. Right? And he says, it is in line with these reports to believe that those birds mentioned sort of refer to a kind of fly or mosquito which carries the germs of some diseases. So it seems sort of sensational to believe that like birds were throwing down stones and killing a whole army. And this is a sort of scientific way of trying to produce a more rational reading of the surah, which involves still flying creatures, but they're mosquitoes, which are known to carry diseases. Okay? Questions or comments about that? Okay, one final example is Sayyid Qutb, who's the rigorist that we mentioned. Again, we see a sort of concern with rationalizing, but there's also a sort of apologetical note here that we can find. Let me go over under the ark, over here, so you can read. And he's going to say here that he has this concern about whether the flood of Noah is to be understood as a local event or a universal global event. And he inclines towards the view that it's a global event. He says, listen, the stories related in the Old Testament refer to the flood. The Old Testament refers to it. But he says, but be careful. None of this should be discussed in conjunction with the Quranic account of the flood. So he's very suspicious of using any sort of biblical information to explain the Quran. Because that would makes the true and accurate account of the Quran with myths of unknown origin and poor authenticity. But he does have this reference to legends which existed, you know. He says, however, the fact that such myths exist and are told in different communities suggests that the floods covered the lands of these communities, or that its memories travel with the offspring of those who were saved. So he does reach outside of the Quran to say that he has some sense that legends about the flood were told even outside of the Bible. Who knows, maybe he's thinking of the Epic of Gilgamesh or other stories about a flood, and that sort of verifies the notion that the flood was universal and not local. Okay, that's the second and last example from modern commentaries. Final comments or questions? Okay, I know that was rushed to bring us through a rich tradition of exegesis on Islam's Holy Scripture, but hopefully at least it gave us some distinctions for the early classical and modern commentaries. Thank you. See you next time.